Does the jighead minnow work without forward-facing sonar? In this video, I'm going to try to answer this question using historical tournament results and a recent trip I took to the lake trying to catch fish with the jighead minnow but not using forward-facing sonar. Let's get into it. The main reason I'm curious about this question is because in the recent Bass Pro Tour event on Lake Conroe, pros were catching fish like crazy on a jighead minnow with forward-facing sonar in the first period of the day, chasing bass that were suspended on shad. However, after the first period, they weren't allowed to use forward-facing sonar anymore, and these pros decided to vacate these areas even though they were catching 15 to 30 bass in just a couple of hours in these small zones. Why would they leave these areas if they were biting so well and if they're catching so many fish on a jighead minnow? Couldn't they just blind cast the minnow around and at least catch 5 or 6 fish in a couple of hours? Well, the pros didn't think so, and I wanted to figure out why this was and see if there were any options that they could have explored to get these fish to bite. I do think one of the main reasons that pros weren't sticking around these areas, just blind casting a jighead minnow, is that the minnow is a very visual bait. It doesn't have a lot of vibration to it, it doesn't have a big presence, so they had to put the bait right in front of the fish's face to get him to bite. Here's a quote from BPT pro Spencer Shuffield explaining the situation.
There's just a lot, there's some scattered standing timber out here, but I'm just getting out in these bait balls and these fish are all floated up out here around this bait. You see them busting through the balls of bait, chasing them and all kinds of stuff. These fish are shallow enough to be caught on a jerkbait, but you cannot catch them blind fishing for them. I mean, the water's not clear enough here to catch them without putting the bait right on their nostrils. It's like they just don't see it. Biggin' right here, boy. I mean, they biggin'. Like 5 something. Dang, dude, I missed her by just a half a foot. Gosh, that's such a big one right there.
No.
Wind's just blowing me to
No.
her. Dang it. I mean, a huge one. That's what I'm saying, this water clarity. I mean, you can't see your bait but about 8 inches deep. That's it. And so you literally have to land it on their nose or they never see it. They'll feel its presence there, whatever it may be. You'll see they kind of make a reaction towards your bait splash in the water or whatnot. But if they don't actually lock eyes with it, you can't catch them.
Based on Spencer's quote, we can see that pros were having to put their minnow within inches of the fish's face to get them to react. And this is going to be nearly impossible without a lot of luck if you're just blind casting in these areas. It's not like there's a fish every 5 feet. These fish might be spread out 30, 40, 50 feet apart. And even though there's a lot of them in this area, the chances of actually landing your bait within 8 inches or 3 inches of a fish's face blind casting is almost impossible. But what if the water was clear, 4 to 5 foot of visibility rather than 6 inches to a foot of visibility? Well, I decided to test this out on a local lake in my area. I found an area that was loaded up with bait and fish. I then caught 5 fish in an hour using forward-facing sonar and a jighead minnow. After that, I turned my forward-facing sonar off and continued blind casting in the area, trying to fish the bait in different depths and hoping that because the water was clear, the fish would be able to track my bait easier and I would only have to bring my bait within maybe 5 feet or 10 feet of a fish to actually get them to bite. Unfortunately, after fishing for 2.5 hours, I only managed to catch 1 bass and 1 crappie in this area. I actually did manage to catch a fish blind casting with the jighead minnow, which was pretty interesting because it means that it's not impossible to catch fish just casting around. But 1 bass in 2.5 hours is not a very good result considering I caught 5 in an hour. I decided to turn the forward-facing sonar back on then and see if maybe the fish just had disappeared or if the bite had shut off. But after I turned it back on, I caught 8 more fish in 35 minutes. This means that the fish were still in the area, they were still eating the minnow, I just wasn't able to put my bait close enough to the fish with enough accuracy to get them to bite. I was fishing in relatively deep water, 30 feet of water, and these fish were roaming around on the bait and the shad. So there is a chance if I was fishing in shallower water, let's say 10 foot or less, maybe I would have had a better chance, but honestly I don't think that it would have been that much better, maybe 1 or 2 extra fish over a 2.5 hour period. This just goes to show how powerful of a tool forward-facing sonar is with the Minnow. And when you have forward-facing, you might be able to catch 5 to 10 fish per hour with it in the right area. But in that same area, if you take forward-facing away, the jig head Minnow now becomes a pretty ineffective tool where you're only catching maybe a fish every 2 hours. Now again, this doesn't mean you can't catch fish on a jig head minnow without forward-facing sonar, and there actually have been tournaments in the past that have been won with a Demiki rig or a jig head minnow before forward-facing sonar. The way that anglers were doing this was using traditional 2D sonar and dropping the bait directly below their boat. In this case though, again, they knew that the fish were right below their boat. They would drop their bait down to the fish, and then back then you would call it video game fishing, where you look at the squiggly lines on your graph and catch fish. And there are several tournaments that got won using this technique with the Demiki rig before forward-facing sonar, but it still kind of relies on using sonar to locate the fish and then catch them. Without forward-facing sonar or 2D sonar to locate the fish before you cast, there really hasn't ever been a good tournament result with the jig head minnow. There are other baits though that are comparable that I use a lot to catch fish offshore, even without forward-facing sonar, and baits I've been using for 10 plus years. Really quick guys, I wanted to let you know about a new traditional offshore fishing playbook I posted on fishthemoment.com. This playbook is focused on finding bass offshore without live sonar. It gives you a lot of detailed information about when, where, and how to develop strategies to find bass offshore that are catchable without the use of live sonar. This is a brand new updated version of my offshore fishing playbook that adds 5 more years of knowledge in finding and catching fish offshore without live sonar. Definitely check it out at fishthemoment.com. One of those baits is a hair jig. In my opinion, a hair jig is very similar to a Demiki rig, especially when the hair jig gets in the water. When a bucktail hair jig gets wet, it has a very similar profile to a jig head with a 4 to 5 inch minnow on it. And I have caught so many fish over the years in a hair jig without forward-facing sonar, winning many tournaments, and there's been a lot of professional tournaments that have been won on this bait as well. The way I fish it though is casting it out, letting it sink all the way down to the bottom, then burning my reel 5 to 6 times to hop that bait off the bottom. I then let the bait fall back down, and then burn my reel handle 5 or 6 more times to bring that bait off the bottom. Most of the time I'm targeting fish that are related to some type of cover or structure, whether that is bass that are setting up on the lip of a ledge or on a hump or on a point. A lot of these fish might be suspended above the ledge or just off the ledge or above the point, but they're related to the point. They're not just randomly swimming around on shad. And I think that's one of the keys to catching fish on a hair jig. The fish are in a relatively stationary position, or at least setting up in a specific zone. There's also enough of them where when I bring my bait through those fish, they get competitive. I very rarely catch fish on a hair jig when there's only one fish in the area. Most of the time there are at least 5 to 8 fish to get competitive on that bait. I've caught fish on a hair jig in as dirty as a foot of water visibility, and then as clear as 10 foot of water visibility, and as shallow as 6 foot, as deep as 50 feet. So it's an effective tool in a lot of depth zones. And I think the key with the hair jig is that that bait is moving very quickly, and it's pulling water as it moves through the water, which gives it a little bit more of a presence and allows bass to track it easier. A lot of guys though with jig head minnow are basically just shaking that bait in the middle of the water column, which is going to displace less water and make it harder for the fish to find the bait or get attracted to it. So as you slow down your bait, it's harder for those fish to, again, track it, and it's hard to get them to commit to the bait. By speeding it up, I find that you can get more bites. As a result, you may be able to catch fish in a jig head minnow by just blind casting in the same areas that I would normally fish a hair jig and working the minnow pretty quickly. You could do this by increasing the weight of the head, going to a 3/8 ounce or a 1/2 ounce head, and then shaking that bait in the middle of the water column. This is actually how I managed to catch my one fish on the jig head minnow blind fishing on my recent trip. I went to a 3/8 ounce head and I was just working the bait pretty aggressively, trying to move it through the water faster, and I was able to catch a bass doing it. So this may be an approach that allows you to catch a few fish. Another option is to actually go to a bigger minnow that hangs in the middle of the water column a little bit more than a standard jig head. One rig that I've had a ton of success with over the past couple of years, with and without forward-facing sonar, is the Hog Farmer 5.5 inch spunk shad with the 4/0 3/8 ounce core tackle tush hook. This setup is almost identical to a jig head minnow, but it has a bigger profile, and by putting all the weight inside of that tush rather than on the outside with the jig head, the bait glides more and will hang in the middle of the water column a lot longer than a standard jig head. I believe this gives bass more time to actually track down the bait, find it, and eat it compared to a standard jig head minnow when you're not using forward-facing sonar. My first trip I ever took with this rig actually was on Grand Lake, and I was just bombing the bait out into a drain or a ditch without using forward-facing sonar and caught over 20 pounds with this rig. I'm fishing it almost the exact same way as a hair jig, but instead of letting the bait go all the way to the bottom, I'm working it through the middle of the water column. I'll let the bait sink down, let's say 10 feet over 20 feet of water, and then try to work it pretty aggressively by twitching my rod and trying to get those fish to come off the bottom to come eat the bait. A lot of the fish are going to be setting up maybe even 5 to 10 feet below the level where my bait is, and they're going to rocket off the bottom to come eat it. I've replicated this pattern dozens of times, and it's actually one of my favorite ways to catch fish now in the summer. You can also fish the same rig like a hair jig and catch fish as well, and I've done that with a lot of success. I think that some days the bass prefer a hair jig where it falls a lot quicker and works down towards the bottom, and other days they prefer the tush with the spunk shad combo, worked more in the middle of the water column. Again though, this is a bigger profile bait. This is a 5.5 inch bait, and I feel like by adding that tush hook in the middle of the bait, it also gives it more of a roll and displaces more water than the standard jig head, which calls those fish to the bait better. Another bait that's historically done well without forward-facing sonar is a jerkbait. A jerkbait is a hard plastic lure with a bill that can suspend in the middle of the water column and stay in front of those fish a little bit longer than a jig head minnow. In addition, it a lot of times has more vibration and flash than a minnow, drawing those fish from further distances. So I think that that is a good alternative to a minnow if you're not using forward-facing sonar. Therefore, based on my recent experiences and recent tournament results, I don't think the jig head minnow is that effective of a tool without the use of forward-facing sonar or traditional 2D sonar to fish underneath the boat. You can still catch fish on it without forward-facing sonar, and a lot of guys in Tennessee have been tight lining for years, which is fishing down bluff walls, basically letting that bait pendulum down to fish that are suspended. And there are other ways that guys are catching fish on a jig head minnow, but overall, I feel like it's not the most effective tool for targeting fish if you have forward-facing sonar. Baits like a hair jig, or maybe that tush with the spunk shad, a jerkbait, or even a glide bait, which have more of a presence, more vibration, and pull fish from further distances, are going to be better without forward-facing sonar because you can't always guarantee your bait is right in front of a fish's face. Now on the flip side, if you do have forward-facing sonar and can put your bait within inches of a fish's face, I feel like a jig head minnow is a great tool because it looks very natural in the water. It doesn't displace a ton of water, it isn't going to have a lot of flash and vibration, and at times that's going to make fish commit a lot easier. So in conclusion, does a jig head minnow work without forward-facing sonar? Yes, but not very well. There are other alternatives that you can use that will get bites in the same situations where you would throw a jig head minnow without forward-facing sonar. The hair jig, tush with the spunk shad, jerkbait, glide bait, even a big jigging spoon or flutter spoon can be great options. But if you do have forward-facing sonar, it's really hard to beat that jig head minnow. It's very natural, it's a great presentation, and we can see from recent tournament results, it is absolutely dominating right now. I'm going to be experimenting with other baits in future videos though to see if I can find something that might be comparable to that jig head minnow and take advantage of some of the same characteristics to give these fish a different presentation. So definitely stay tuned to Fish the Moment to see more content like that. As always though, I will also be making videos without forward-facing sonar showing you guys how to use traditional methods to catch offshore bass. So stay tuned for all that content. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a comment down below letting me know what you think. And other than that, we'll see you guys in the next video.